I'm Akabaka, or Joseph Hunter. I'm a video game developer from Baltimore, Maryland. I've made a few projects, some of which have had a little bit of rally to behind them. I made the Sucker for Love series, which is an eldritch horror dating sim psych horror that recently came out with its second game last April. I'm also the developer for the game jam game Dark Where the Clouds and the visual novel Chromatose, which is the visual novel RPG that I've been working on for the longest time period.
Let's start there. I guess before we even sort of get there, how did you even sort of get your start into making games or wanting to make games? Like, how did you even come up with these sort of ideas? Obviously, the path you take in looking at some of the visuals and stuff, it's a lot different than what I guess some people would be used to, or some people kind of see as more of a anime vibe type of thing. So, like, just kind of explain like what it is and kind of how you came about that idea.
I was a dungeon master in D&D. Long before I was doing any sort of game development, I was just DMing for my table. I don't think I ever was anything besides the dungeon master. I really liked telling stories. I really liked interactive experiences like that. I put a lot of effort into it. And at the end of the campaigns, I'd be kind of bummed that the stories kind of live and die by the 5 people that experienced it. And so I was looking for ways to be able to share these stories with more people besides just the people that were there. And so I dipped my toes into a couple of mediums like animation, but I found that the only medium that was close enough to a one-to-one interactive roleplay experience, as though I was your DM, was video games, heavily influenced by 90s anime, like the Persona series, since those were like some of my favorite mediums. And so Comatose pulls a lot from like Persona 4 and 5. And then Sucker for Love pulls a lot from 90s anime. And then I guess Dark Where the Clouds was somewhere a crisscross between the two, since it's what I know how to do. Love mechanics, crafting mechanics, and Lovecraftian horror. And so I was kind of a visual novel developer at the time, so I didn't have a lot of game development experience to go into this. And so I wasn't going to be able to like churn out a huge crafting system in like 10 days. So I decided like creating items and using items was close enough. And then a game genre that has crafting mechanics and love mechanics is like dating sim. And so the only missing piece of the puzzle at that point was Lovecraftian horror. And so that's sort of how Sucker for Love was born, as a Lovecraftian horror dating sim. That the game was really well received in the collection. It was kind of really standout. Interestingly, just going off of the achievements, about 80% of the people that bought the collection beat Sucker for Love, where on average it was about 40%. So the publisher approached me about turning it into a full series after completing the Sucker for Love First Date and Sucker for Love Date to Die for the most recent sequel. The contracts are on its course, and so now I'm free to do whatever I want to do with the IP. So there's probably more coming down the line.
It was obviously well received. What are the things you've sort of learned from making this game, and what are the things you're going to take into future projects, future games, and things like that?
Scope down. Yeah, games always run late and they always run big. So, making sure to scope down is very important. And then I think one of the things that I also learned is to remember to have fun. If I'm not having fun, then the player isn't either. That kind of comes from being a dungeon master as well.
Being a dungeon master, like, did you play any video games as far as attached to that? Obviously, you getting into game creation and stuff like that. You kind of talked about that progression, but like, usually people don't go from sort of that to game creation. You see what I'm saying? Like, it's more sort of and I mean, I guess it's not an easy way sort of to get into the gaming sort of scene without either knowing somebody or, I guess nowadays you could sort of go the school route or try to, get an internship or something like that. But yours was a lot more natural as far as kind of how it progressed.
Yeah, I mean, I played video games since I was a kid, but my background is not in game development. It was actually in biochemistry, which I went to school for. I was kind of doing dungeon mastering, and then by extension, game development as a hobby on the side while I was going to school for bioengineering and biochem.
Okay.
It was just kind of at one point I was at a crossroads where it's like, well, I could keep going down the science route, which I'm not really feeling, or I could try out games for a while. And I
Hmm.
gave it a shot. I ran a Kickstarter which funded, and then from that point on, just started making games instead.
I was a history major before I started doing all this stuff, and I kind of understand that trajectory. That's kind of interesting. As far as like, the genres you are in, like, are you sort of tied to those? Like, do you have game other like sort of game ideas like you have that you kind of want to do? Like, sort of, how do you approach even going about like, hey, I want to go down this path as far as creating this game, or I want to think about this idea, make it come true.
I would say that I'm very fickle when it comes to genres, and I'll quickly jump on or off a boat depending on if it serves the purpose of the game. So Dark with the Clouds was almost just straight platformer, almost no dialogue whatsoever. But that's just because the nature of the game was what was not super dialogue heavy.
Hmm.
For the most part, since I'm coming from a dungeon master, it's lots of characters, lots of interactions, lots of dialogue, lots of story. So most of the games that I make tend to be at least a little bit visual novel. But for the most part, I kind of go off the wall in terms of just jumping to whatever genre best serves the game, and then if it doesn't exist, creating it.
What is your feel, I guess, for the nearest future? Are you just thinking about, hey, I'm thinking about maybe adding more pieces to Sucker for Love? Like, do you have any sort of new IPs that you are excited for, new ideas that you kind of want to approach?
So the first thing on deck is to finish Chromatose, since that was the
Mm.
Kickstarter game that I've got to wrap up now that the contract with the publisher has run its course. I'm free to go back to my personal projects. Maybe down the line, I'll probably be continuing Sucker for Love. It's just going from publisher to no publisher can be a transition.
Hmm.
So um, I probably need to secure funding, ideally in the form of my own games as success.
Hmm.
But we're looking at Chromatose, we're looking at Sucker for Love, and then maybe jams or small commissions down the line just to keep
Hmm.
lights on.
Talk about that. A lot of the people that I've talked to have been more like on the indie side, or they're kind of working on their own projects. It is that trying to find funding or trying to create the things that they want to create under certain circumstances. Whereas, like, you kind of have experienced both, where it's like you have the publisher side, you have the things that you kind of want to do on your own. Sort of, what is that experience like? Like, how different is it? How much do you enjoy one over the other? Like, kind of what's the differences there?
So they each have their struggles for sure. I think it all kind of boils down to what you want for your game. So the benefit to a publisher, as long as it's like a legit one, is that you won't have to worry about like keeping the lights on month to month, since you'll
Gotcha.
generally have some sort of arrangement with them, either a monthly stipend for game dev or at least the promise of some sort of rev share. What you give up in return is that, um, well, lately with the sort of climate in game development is that a lot of corporate interest has kind of invaded the game dev scene. And so you have a lot of people sort of in the medium for the wrong reason, I feel.
Okay.
And so a publisher, as much as they are in the game space, a publisher is not really there to make games. They're there to make money off of making games.
Hmm.
And a kind of realization that sets in is what makes a game good and what makes a game successful sound like two compatible objectives, but they're actually enemies. Putting in a whole, another set of levels as free DLC makes a game good, but it doesn't make it financially successful. So under a
Hmm.
publisher, it probably won't happen. You'll find a lot of things cut or a lot of deadlines short, or maybe your game not necessarily getting to reach what you wanted out of it just because it doesn't fit within your publisher's goals. It's going to hamper the passion a little bit in the interest of success.
Hmm.
So it's kind of opportunity cost. It's you won't have to worry about money in the interim, but you're also not necessarily going to get to do whatever you want to do with your game anymore. As opposed to indie, you're kind of free to do whatever you want for better and worse, in that you won't really have anyone to answer to if you decide to go completely off the rails and do something nutty that will never sell.
Mm-hmm.
But once you start, as long as you're holding yourself to a certain level of quality, and you start making a name for yourself that way, and people come to expect, okay, this guy is not just making shovelware and releasing
Mm-hmm.
it. Then you'll start building a community that will just start playing pretty much whatever you make. And names like David Szymanski come to mind with this, where, as for the most part, as far as I know, they haven't got a publisher. They just release games that catch on, and then once you have a game that catches on, you can keep releasing games without ever needing to turn to a publisher, since you have that passive income coming from the previous titles that you need to
Mm-hmm.
fund subsequent ones, and then keeping the lights on in the meantime. So if you're in a situation where you can afford to not make money for years on end, like either you're married and you're a house husband like me, or you're in school as a student, then that seems like a pretty safe bet. Otherwise, if you just really can't, get rolling on this without a publisher, then a publisher is also a fine option,
Mm-hmm.
at least
And
to get
so,
started,
yeah,
because you get industry experience.
yeah, no doubt. It's hard enough to get into these channels, I guess you could say. From the outside looking in, it just seems like it is a lot more difficult. But I mean, now the time we're in is easier than it's ever been just because there are so many avenues. What sort of advice would you give someone if they were trying to pursue the same sort of goals you were, or just trying to take a similar path?
Yeah, take care of your mental health. Number one, it's really easy. Even if you're indie, it's really easy to doom spiral that no one's ever going to play my game, or to look at another game and be like, oh, their game is so successful and mine is not, or never will be, et cetera, et cetera. And under a publisher, it's easy to get crunched or death marched, or a lot of anxiety under the pressure of delivering, et cetera. You see it a lot more in newer devs than older ones, about people like melting down over needing to delay their game or not being able to meet deadlines that they've promised. When the reality is, damn near every game comes in about 10 to 30% late at minimum. The vets kind of understand this and can take a breath and understand, well, I could miss my kid's event, or my family reunion, or something like a major life experience, and then be able to finish this on time. But that's not really healthy, sustainable, or good for you to do so. Is that
Mm-hmm.
game development should be like priority number 4 in terms in your life.
Yeah.
Even if it's your passion, even if you want it to kill you, it really shouldn't be higher than like 4, where like
Mm-hmm.
your health is number 1, your family is like number 2, and then your happiness is number 3. So that's probably what I would recommend, is make sure you keep things in perspective and try to stay happy day to day without depending on, and then number 2 piece of advice is, don't wait for a publisher or for fans to give you flowers. You should kind of, as a learned skill, learn to be able to get them for yourself,
Mm-hmm.
not be waiting for other people's permission to feel proud about what you're making. Because a lot of times it might take a very long time to ever happen, if it does. And if you're kind of dependent on other people's approval, other people's permission to feel good about what you've made, you're going to turn over. There's
Mm-hmm.
just, you're going to drop out and quit, because that kind of gratification just doesn't come in quickly enough and in enough spades to rationalize staying. So
Yeah.
make sure
Mm-hmm.
you're proud of yourself for what you accomplished.
The question is, would you take an opportunity like that to work on a AAA game or a big old game that you might like, or does it mean more to you to sort of work on your own projects and sort of work on your own thing, and kind of able to manage all of those things that you're talking about?
Yeah, I can't imagine myself making somebody else's game. For the most part, I can't imagine myself making somebody else's game in my life. Only time I could ever see myself going triple A, at least right now, is if I was in some sort of creative position. So I was like a writer, or some sort of creative director over something like that. But for the most part, I like staying at the level where I can do something absolutely insane, like, I don't know, make a Lovecraftian dating sim, But
Yeah.
I like kind
Yeah.
of staying around that level of indie where there's still a lot of freedom and a lot of
Hmm.
expression. If I want to do something completely nutty, I don't have to worry about getting investors on board, and I don't have to worry about trying to convince people to trust the process or trust the vision.
Hmm. Hmm.
If I say, hey, I think this is a really nutty idea, that's kind of the start and end of it. Is I can just lock in and do that. That's kind of the fun part. I think of game dev is kind of the serendipity of being able to have a really fun or really interesting idea just strike you, and then being able to just jump into it without having to fuss too much
Hmm.
about market trends or investors or I have a whatever percent loan to keep this company afloat.
With the things that you have accomplished, and obviously, you have projects you're working on now and stuff, like what is sort of your end goal or sort of like an ultimate goal that you're sort of pushing for? Like, do you want to have a game that is just, massively successful? Like, do you just want to continue to just make these projects and, like you said, continue to sort of expound on these ideas that you have? Like, what is ultimately success for you, or what is ultimately like the, like, oh, I've made it sort of moment for you?
I had a list of things that I wanted to have happen um, over my career in game dev, and fortunately, I've already checked off all of those boxes, so I'm already
Hmm.
kind of scooting along. But it was things like take a picture with somebody cosplaying my game, which I managed to have happen a year ago, and that was kind of
Hmm.
the last thing on the list. So um, I'm already pretty happy with my situation,
Hmm.
but in terms of goals from here on out, I don't necessarily know if I really want like a smash hit game, just because it
Hmm.
seems like a lot of pressure and a lot of answering to random people who played my game.
Yeah.
I would like a successful game, or like rather, I'd like the games to succeed and do very very well. I don't need like a Doki Doki Literature Club or an Undertale. I think I'd honestly be happy with just more Sucker for Loves, since those
Hmm.
did pretty well and they were relatively easy to turn around. The first one was turned around in 4 months, so I think success would look like just being able to live comfortably and fund my own projects ad infinitum. Just make enough off each game to stay alive, live well, and fund my next game. And that's kind of all I really need, I think, because I'm just here to make the games. That is what I find most fun.
If you want to plug anything, if you got any socials, how people can reach you if you like to, just plug yourself here.
Sure. I'm Akabaka. You can find me on Twitter as Chromatose Dev or Akabaka. I'll come up for either one. Stay tuned for more Sucker for Love developments. Stay tuned for Chromatose developments. I have all sorts of irons in the oven in terms of merch, and an IP is coming down the line. So if you liked what I put out, definitely stay tuned because there's a lot more coming along the way.
Last question, you said you actually got to take a picture with somebody who cosplayed your game and stuff like that. How active are you as far as going to conferences and indulging in all of these different cons and all of these different cosplay events that kind of happen?
I turn up at a couple of cons a year, I think,
Hmm.
usually through some sort of because I don't usually just go just for the hell of it. I usually have some sort of reason. I'll be joining a panel that one of my friends is running. I went to GDC on scholarship, and I went to PAX in the past to support my games. So if I'm at a convention, I'm usually there because I've got something to plug or something to promote. But yeah, I would say that I'm going to these conventions maybe twice a year or so.
Gotcha. Just